In this particular lesson, we're going to start by looking at HTML forms and how we use them in our applications to collect data from users. We're going to look at the high-level components that are involved in an HTML form, what you need to put them together, and we'll see how you can not only structure your forms in logical ways, but how you submit those forms, or how you allow the user to submit the data that they've entered. HTML, or Hypertext Markup Language, is all about presenting data that's on a server to your users. Originally meant for research data, today it could be information about your products that you sell, or about your company, your organization, or your social group. HTML forms are about allowing the users of your website to provide data to the server. So it's all about providing a constrained, structured way for users to enter information and submit it to the server for you to process. We've all used HTML forms on the web to order things from commerce sites, submit comments, provide contact information, or sign up for services. So the way they work from the user perspective is probably pretty well known to you, but we're going to look at how they work under the covers. In order to build an HTML form, you start with a form element. This is a container for all of the elements that we typically think of as the form, and it provides instructions to the client, usually a web browser, about how to process that information in the form when the user submits it. Inside of the form element, we have a variety of input elements. Everything from text boxes to date pickers, check boxes, drop downs, all of those different ways that we can provide information inside of the form component. And finally, we have a button or mechanism for submitting the form, indicating that we're done filling it out. We want to send that information to the server to be processed. So let's dive right in and start creating a few basic forms so we can see how these form elements, input elements, and submit buttons work together, and how, when we do that submit, the data gets transmitted to the server for processing. Before we get started with the demonstrations, I want to show you how you can get your environment set up to match mine. First, I'm using Visual Studio Code, which is a free code editor from Microsoft that's cross-platform, so you can use this on Windows or Mac. And inside of Visual Studio Code, I'm going to use a tool in order to help sync up changes that I make with the browser and to help me view these changes in the browser. So I'm going to show you two different options you can choose from depending on your comfort and your setup. So here on the Extensions tab of the Visual Studio Code, if you go search for Live Server, you'll find an extension out here, and there's others like it that you can use, and you can see I've already got it installed. You may see an install button here, and this is going to allow you down in the status bar to click Go Live, and it will pull your pages up into a browser. So let's try that out. I'm going to switch over to the left side here, go back to my files. We'll open the index.html, click Go Live, and it's going to bring up the site in my browser. And this is the site we'll be using in the course. It's Bethany's Pie Shop, which you may have seen in some other courses on Pluralsight. It's one of our fictitious online retailers with all sorts of beautiful, delicious pies that we'll be able to work with. So what you'll see, I'm going to come into the index.html file and change this our history to my history, and that's going to be right below the image there. And if I save that, it'll update automatically in the browser. So that extension is not only serving up this page, but it's also then keeping track of changes to the files and refreshing them. Now, another option you have, which works similarly, but if you're using Node.js or plan to use Node.js, you can use this. And you'll see that I have a package.json file that describes our application here for Node.js. And I can go to the terminal, get a new terminal, and I can run npm install. And that's going to see inside of my package.json this dev dependencies for something called browser sync. And it's going to go ahead and update that or install it. And now you'll notice I have a script down here called dev that will run that browser sync and similarly serve up these files. So that script gets called from Visual Studio Code. We have a special folder here, the .vs code, and it has a launch.json file that describes how to do debugging or launch services inside Visual Studio Code. So this one is set up to run npm, the Node Package Manager, and run that script in my package.json file called dev. So again, if we switch this over here, we can now go to this Run tab on the left side, or you can come up to the menus and go to the Run menu, and you can just run without debugging. And that's going to do something similar to what we saw before, which is it's going to start that browser sync that's going to serve up our page here. And again, if we go back over here to our index.html, we can go back and fix our file back to where it was, do our history and save, and that gets updated. So the choice is yours. Either of those will work. They work similarly, so you'll see the changes. Let me come in here and stop our session where we're running this. If you're going to do Node.js-based development, you can use that option. You've already got that installed. If you don't have Node.js installed or aren't sure, the extension will work as well. When we get to the point where we're sending some form data to the servers, in both cases, we're going to see errors back from the web server, and that's okay. We'll still be able to see the data that we're sending. And in the end, to process form data, you're going to need a server running some code, be that PHP or ASP.NET or Node.js, that can take that form information and do something with it. So we'll talk about that as we go. But with Visual Studio Code and either the live server, which you can start and stop down here in the status bar, or that browser sync by doing npm install and then using the run commands, you'll be able to make changes in your editor and side by side see those update in the browser when you save the files. Now that we're all set up, let's go ahead and open that index.html, and I'm going to collapse the files here. And let's go down to the aside, and this is our list on the left, or our set of links that take you to other pages, and we're going to add a form. So we'll just start with a form, we'll add an input, and then we'll add an input type equals submit, and that's going to be our submit button there. And I'll save that. I'm going to go ahead and come over to the right. I'm going to do Control F5 to run using that browser sync, but you can use the live server. You can see now we have this form down here. It's empty. And if I type in something here, like maybe I want to search for apple pie and hit submit, you look up in the address bar, you'll see that we do have now this question mark. And so that indicates that we're going to have additional parameters on our URL beyond the page or the HTML document that we're trying to get, but nothing's showing up there. So if we come back over, the main reason is our input doesn't have a name. So let's give it a name. We'll just call it Q for query. We'll save again. Our page refreshes. Let's try that again. We'll search for apple pie, hit submit, and now if you look up there in the URL, you'll see we have Q equals apple plus pie. So the Q is the name of our form element, that input, and the apple plus pie is the text, but it's encoded for the URL. So that little plus is an encoding of that space that was between my apple and pie. Now what's happening here is we're using some defaults with the form. We haven't really configured the form itself. So let's come back in here. We could change our action. So the action is, where is this request going to get submitted? And by default, it came right back to the index.html. But what if we did something like this, search.html? So let's go ahead and save that. And let's come into the files here. And we do want to add a new file. Let's just do a new file. We'll call it search.html. And in there, I'm going to type HTML, and I'm going to use this HTML5 expansion. You can see we get an HTML5 page. We can just put something here like an H2, and we'll say search page, just so we have some visual indicator. All right, if we go back over here now and we search for, let's search for blueberry and submit. Notice we got the search page, so search HTML, and now Q equals blueberry up in the address bar. So a form doesn't have to submit its data back to the same page that served it. It can serve it up to a different page or handler in your server. One of the other things we can change here is the method. So the method defaulted to a get, where we just request a particular resource. But if I change this to post and we save, I'm going to go ahead and come back over now. We'll search for cherry, get some variety here so we hit everybody's favorites. And this is where we run into a little bit of limitation with these tools, whether it's browser sync or the live server, in that they don't handle post requests. And that's okay, because we're still going to be able to see the data that we send across. So I'm going to hit F12 here to bring up the developer tools. I've got the network tab opened, so we'll see network traffic. We get a little more real estate here on the screen so we can actually see the page. Let's go ahead and submit that again. You'll see there's our search HTML. And if we click and we go down, we can see the form data. And it just says Q as cherry. We view the source. Notice, again, Q equals cherry. You can view the parsed data or the URL encoded. Doesn't really change for what we've submitted here. But this allows you to see what is the form data that went across here. And when you go look at the general here, you'll see the request URL with that search.html, as well as a request method of post. Depending on the tool you're using, you may get a 404, meaning file not found, or a 405, meaning method not supported, meaning the post method isn't supported. But again, we can still see here in the tools within our browsers, what is it that we're submitting, and see what that form data looks like. So the last thing that we want to look at is something known as the encoding type, or enc type. You'll notice I get help here. There's 3 different options. The first is application/x www form URL encoded, or we shorthand usually refer to that as URL encoded. And that again is the default that we've been using and what you'd use for most forms today. We also have multi-part form data, which is what you'd use if you were going to submit information about a file, for example. So let's just set that and see what happens when we do this post. We'll go back here. We'll refresh so we get that change. And let's search for cherry pie. We'll submit. We go look here. Notice the source now doesn't have just that URL encoded. It's multi-part. So we have a part at the top with form data, name equals Q, and the value cherry pie. And we have these boundaries. And this is what allows you to supply both form data in terms of these text values we're sending and file data that could be in its own separate part with its own boundaries. Let's go ahead and we'll fix this back here. I'm going to change this encoding type back to the default, and I'm going to change the method back to get. So we'll see that on that main page, we're just going to be able to go back and search over to the search page. Make sure that's all working. Don't need to watch here. There we go. We've got our search.html back with our cherry pie. So we can stop running. And we've now got a basic form where we can control the action, the encoding type, and the method we use. And we've got some basic inputs and our submit button. In this lesson, we've seen that forms provide that user interaction to our websites. It allows the user to participate in the site and to contribute information to the service, which then can enable the content creation. We've also seen technically how that form data is sent over HTTP to the server, both from the HTML elements that make up the forms, as well as the HTTP request, that post or get, that sends the information over to the server, where it can then be processed by a server-side web technology, such as ASP.NET, PHP, Node.js. As we continue through the course, we'll dive into the various input elements that we can use. We'll see how to better organize our forms so that they make logical sense to the users, and how to do things like validate the user input. So I hope you'll continue on with me to the next lesson.